within planetary systems. So, as Anne mentioned, most of the work you're going to see here is a part of the 4D initiative in deep time data-driven discovery, which is quite a tongue twister, sorry about that. This initiative is bringing together researchers from a broad swath of Earth, space, life, and data science to answer questions to answer interdisciplinary questions that one field alone cannot tackle by itself. Now, my background is in mineralogy and crystallography, not data science. In fact, until a few years ago, I knew nothing about machine learning or multidimensional visualization. But through several collaborations, particularly with Bob Hazen at Carnegie and Peter Fox at RPI, I began to learn more about these techniques and to see how they could be used to transform my field of mineralogy. And I have to say it's been fascinating for me to watch and be a part of my field of mineralogy going from what for years has been largely descriptive science into a much more integrated and predictive one. We've developed techniques such as mineral ecology, which relies on statistics and accumulation curves to make predictions of the number of mineral species we've yet to discover on Earth's crust. Through mineral evolution studies, we've been able to characterize the pulses of mineralization associated with supercontinent assembly, as well as track the oxidation of Earth's atmosphere through the redox state of minerals through deep time. With mineral network analysis, we found a method for visualizing and analyzing complex multivariate, multidimensional mineral systems in a way that is digestible by the human brain, unlike a spreadsheet or a large data table. With this technique, we've discovered embedded trends related to chemistry and time, and we're also investigating whether or not Earth's unique mineral distribution is a planetary scale biosignature, which could have obvious applications in planetary exploration, both in our solar system and beyond. We've also used other machine learning techniques, such as association analysis or affinity analysis, to predict the location of new mineral localities. This algorithm can also help us predict planetary analog sites, like a Mars analog site, or the entire mineral inventory of a location of interest. So this is quite a powerful technique, and I'll tell you more about that in a bit. And the last project I'll mention quickly and expand on a little more later is the evolutionary system of mineralogy, which I'm working on with Bob Hazen. And we're using natural kind clustering of the complex chemical and physical attributes of minerals to characterize their formational environments and stages of planetary evolution. Then we can actually use these clusterings or results to classify the formational environment of a sample of unknown origin. So these techniques and ideas are allowing us to tackle several large-scale driving scientific questions that are underlying all of this work. And firstly, I'm working to characterize changes in the diversity and distribution of Earth's mineral species and its impact on geologic events and processes. We're collaborating with biologists to better understand and deconvolve the complex feedback systems between Earth and life, and that will allow us to better understand the coevolution of the geosphere and biosphere. And I'm also very interested in understanding what are the most robust and unambiguous biosignatures and how can we detect them on other planetary bodies. So why minerals? I probably don't need to say this with this crowd, but I will anyway because I love minerals and so I'm going to talk about them. Firstly, they're the oldest physical samples of the geologic past. We don't have ancient DNA, right? But we do have ancient rocks. Secondly, within their complex chemical and physical characteristics, they contain information about their formational conditions and any subsequent weathering and alteration they might have undergone. They characterize the availability, speciation, and therefore bioavailability of elements through deep time, and they allow us to relate the timing of elemental availability potentially to the emergence and evolution of biological function and other large and even small scale events and processes through deep time. So now I'd like to go into a little more detail about 3 projects that we're actively working on. Let's just dive right into mineral network analysis. We'll start there. We're using this technique in a few different systems, but today I'll mostly focus on that of minerals, although I'll briefly mention fossils as well. The diversity, distribution, and composition of minerals provide a framework for answering questions and for making predictions regarding the timing, extent, underlying cause, and relationships between complex geologic, biologic, and planetary events through deep time. So we needed a tool that would allow us to visualize, analyze, and explore these very complex systems, and network analysis is ideal for that. And I'll give you some examples of why that is. So the first network I'd like to show you is that of copper minerals. In this network, each node represents a copper mineral species. They're colored according to chemistry, specifically the presence or absence of sulfur and oxygen. The nodes are sized according to their frequency of occurrence on Earth's surface. So if they occur often, they're larger. And lastly, the links are scaled inversely proportional to the frequency of co-occurrence. So if two minerals occur together frequently, they'll be closer together. That link will be shorter. If they occur together less frequently, that link will be farther apart. Now, if we take a look at this network as a whole, you'll probably notice that we have some distinct chemical partitioning. The sulfides tend to form with the sulfides, the oxides tend to form with the oxides, and the sulfides tend to form with the sulfates. It's important to understand that the only information included in the layout is mineral occurrence and co-occurrence. The fact that chemistry is so evident here is not because we coded it into the network layout, but because it is naturally embedded in the data, within the relationships between these mineral species. In fact, we can even go as far as to look at redox axes in this network. So we can see an oxygen fugacity line. We can also see a sulfur fugacity trend. One of the most useful features of networks is that you can overlay any attribute of the nodes you're exploring. So we could overlay chemistry, as I showed you in the last example. We could overlay age, number of localities, paragenetic mode, or any other parameter you'd like. You can size, shape, or adjust the transparency of the nodes or the links in order to represent whatever attributes and relationships you're interested in studying. So it's really a powerful way to represent many different attributes of the data all at one time in a way that our brains can handle it. Here you can see the co-occurrence network of chromium mineral species colored by their formational environment. You can straight away see that there's a natural segregation based on formational environment, with weathering minerals tending to form together, sedimentary minerals tending to form together, and so on. This network is highly centralized, with chromite being the main broker node that co-occurs with many of the other phases in the network. This is largely due to the fact that chromite is often the primary chromium phase, and the other phases result as weathering or alteration products. These networks are highly interactive. If you go to our website, which I'll give you at the end, you can hover over a node and you can find out what it is, and you can pull them out and move them around to get a better vantage point of what's going on, as you can see me doing in this video here. Next, I'd like to show you a different type of network. This is a bipartite network of carbon minerals and their localities on Earth. So here we have two different types of nodes. The colored nodes correspond to carbon mineral species, and the black nodes correspond to the localities at which these carbon minerals are found on Earth's surface. The mineral nodes are sized by their frequency, sized and colored actually by their frequency of occurrence, but let's change that and we can color them by their age of first occurrence. The black locality nodes here are sized according to their mineral diversity, or the number of distinct mineral species that are found there. So more mineralogical diversity, a larger locality node. There are a number of interesting pieces of information we can get out of these networks, but for today I'd like to illustrate just two of them. The first is that this network topology may be a biosignature on a planetary scale. And the second is that there are timelines embedded in the network topologies of evolving systems. So let's start with biosignatures. This network illustrates well the diversity and distribution of minerals on Earth's surface. The mineral frequency distribution that we have on Earth follows an LNRE, or large number of rare events trend, which basically means that most mineral species are rare, as you can see by the number of small nodes that are skirting the outside of that network. And there are only a few minerals that are very common, which are those you see nested here right inside the network. This is a visual representation of this distribution, and this, coupled with the high mineral diversity, appears to be unique within our solar system and is likely the result of biological input. We've begun trying to evaluate the mineral diversity and distribution of other planetary bodies, specifically Mars with meteorite and surface mission data, the Moon with lunar samples, and Vesta with HUD meteorites. At this point, it's very hard to make a direct comparison, except perhaps with the Moon, because meteorites are generally igneous in origin, and surface missions have only sampled a very small area and have limited technology. But it does preliminarily look like the mineral diversity of these bodies is significantly lower, and the phases that are present do not follow an LNRE frequency distribution. So this is an idea we're exploring, but the diversity and distribution of minerals we observe on Earth very well may be a planetary scale biosignature, and we may be able to use that for planetary exploration. So now back to the second feature of bipartite networks I wanted to show you, which is the embedded timeline. Here we see the same carbon network in which the mineral nodes are colored by age, with red being the oldest. And if you look at the network there, you can see we're moving up into yellow and into green and out into blue as it's skirting up and around that locality kind of U shape, if you will. Again, no age information was put into the network layout, and this timeline just naturally falls out of the data. This is also true of fossil networks, which I think is pretty intuitive given this is Darwinian evolution. But there's one additional interesting piece of information that we can get out of these fossil networks, and that's mass extinctions. Here we see the coexistence of animal species through time, starting in the Cambrian, going into the Paleozoic, and then into modern fauna. There's an obvious timeline, which we expected, but we didn't exactly expect to see these pinch points in the network. And it turns out that each of these pinch points correspond to a known mass extinction event in the fossil record. It's very important that when we're trying out these new techniques or any new technique, that you learn to identify things that you already know to be true, like these mass extinctions. Now we know that with these pinch points, this type of signal may point to a punctuated event in the evolutionary record. So when we turn to the trilobite network and immediately found a pinch point here towards the end of the trilobite reign, it didn't correspond to any known mass extinction event. My colleague Drew Masenti started digging into this problem and found that this punctuation event corresponds to a massive faunal turnover towards the end of the trilobite record. A few older papers had speculated that something might have happened here, but it wasn't exactly clear or well studied. And with just one glance at the network, we were able to clearly see this event, and my colleague was able to characterize it. So it's a pretty powerful tool. And the last network analysis related project I'd like to mention is the most interdisciplinary of them all, and that's studying the coevolution of proteins and the geologic environment. This work is part of the larger NASA astrobiology ENIGMA project to better understand the origin and evolution of proteins and catalysis. In this project, we're using metagenomic, geochemical, mineralogical, tectonic, and environmental data. It's certainly the most interdisciplinary data set I've worked with, and for me it's been like drinking from a fire hose, trying to learn all about all of these different data, especially as it pertains to biology. And I won't go into great detail here, but we're basically aiming to answer questions about whether or not microbial populations and their expressed protein functions are constrained by their geochemical environment. And likewise, what effects do they have on their surrounding environments? And we want to know whether or not metal availability through geologic time affected protein evolution. And the answer to that question, it's very difficult to get at, but if we find that answer, however convoluted, is yes, then we might be able to use the bioavailability of these metals in the mineralogical record to constrain the actual timing of protein evolution. They know relative timing, but absolute timing is something that's really hard to get at, and that's something that the mineralogical record may be able to offer. Let's move on to the second project I'd like to mention, and I alluded to this earlier. This is mineral association analysis. So this is a recommender system that characterizes multidimensional co-occurrence relationships and creates probabilistic models for future or currently unknown co-occurrences. Most of you have actually encountered these types of algorithms with companies like Amazon or Netflix, who use purchase history of all of their users to predict what you might want to buy or watch based on just a few selections. Like them, we can leverage our large mineral occurrence data resources and characterize these multi-mineral, multi-dimensional correlations and generate probabilities of where else we might expect to find a given mineral, mineral assemblage, geologic environment, things like that. So we do this by generating a list of association rules. These rules are made up of a left-hand side, or LHS here in the diagram, which is a mineral assemblage, and an right-hand side, or RHS, which is a single mineral or mineral assemblage we'd like to characterize in terms of the left-hand side. So for example, if you have calcite, pyrite, quartz, and sphalerite at a particular locality, you have a certain likelihood that that locality will also contain chalcopyrite. There are various metrics for quantifying that probability that I won't go into today, but I'd be happy to discuss that later if you're interested. This can be illustrated with a graphical representation where the size of the circles indicates how often the rule occurs in our data set. The more occurrences, the more statistically significant. We can also examine these rules as directed co-occurrence networks in which we can clearly see trends in which minerals tend to occur most frequently and which minerals are most often associated with one another. And if you're interested in playing with these, I do have these up on the web, and they'll be published with our paper once we submit it, which will be soon. Because this problem is very computationally intensive and requires high performance computing, we're working to optimize the code. But in the meantime, we've started with a case study to apply this technique to a few select subsets of data that doesn't crash the supercomputer. And they're specifically based on geography, geochemistry, and time. The first is a geographic subset of the United States, and this was chosen because the data for the US have high mineralogical diversity, a good deal of documentation, extensive geographic coverage, and a broad range of geologic environments. The second subset was geochemical and was selected for uranium due to its role in the redox history of various deposit types, as well as the interest in nuclear energy and nuclear forensics. And note that while we're using uranium as the starting point for selecting mineral localities, we actually use all of the minerals at each of those localities. Lastly, we selected all mineral occurrences dated to the Paleozoic or earlier in order to examine mineral associations through deep time and compare mineral relationships at different stages of planetary evolution, so breaking up those time periods. We're actively exploring these systems, but I'll give you a few preliminary examples of the types of queries we can run. For instance, we may have a particular locality of interest that we'd like to know what minerals we expect to find there that we haven't already discovered. If we select Wave Hill in the Northern Territory, we see that we have a high probability of finding analcime, epidote, hematite, and so on. This could be used on a locality of any size, from a tiny hot spring to an entire planet. Next, we could have a particular mineral that we're interested in and would like to know where else we're likely to discover the next occurrence. So for instance, based on association rules of rhodochrosite, rhodonite, and tephroite, I can predict that there is a high likelihood that tephroite could also be found at a couple of locations in Kazakhstan, as well as in the US and Sweden. Remember, these rules can also make predictions on mineral assemblages. So we can predict deposits or environments that are characterized by certain mineral assemblages. For instance, if I would like to know a location that may be a good Mars analog, I can predict which locations are most likely, even when all of the minerals are not currently known at that locality. So based on all known mineral occurrences, we can ask questions like, where can I find a new locality of a certain mineral? What other minerals, as yet unreported, can I find at a locality of interest? And where can I find a deposit or environment of interest? This algorithm allows us to characterize mineral occurrences across our planet and other planetary bodies, and it's just one really cool example of the predictive power and possibility that lies within these multidimensional machine learning applications. And in fact, we've actually been able to ground truth this method with a very simple pairwise implementation on MinDat. Jolly and Ralph, who I think many of you are probably familiar with, was able to predict that there would be an unreported occurrence of wolfenite in New Mexico. And with this information, MinDat associate Aaron Delventhal was able to go out in search of this wolfenite and was able to confirm that it does indeed occur at that predicted locality. So it's pretty exciting to get some ground truth straight away on this method. The next project I'd like to mention is the development of the evolutionary system of mineralogy and natural kind clustering within that system. This work harnesses the fact that minerals are incredibly information rich. They offer the opportunity to integrate their characteristics and parameters, such as minor and trace elements, isotopic ratios, structural defects, inclusions, textures, morphologies. And with that, we can gain a multidimensional, holistic mineralogical perspective of the dynamic chemical, geological, biological, and planetary materials and processes through time. This work is ultimately asking the question, how do we determine the formational environment of a mineral sample? Let's take an example of pyrite. Pyrite forms in many different environments and ways, some of which have biological input. But if I tell you that I found a pyrite on Mars, what does that tell you about the Martian environment? Not a whole lot. It tells you that I could have had a range of conditions and materials, but that's not very helpful for determining the geological conditions or if there was any biological input into those environments. However, that information is locked within each mineral specimen. And in order to extract that information, we've turned to our colleagues, Ross Large and Dan Gregory at the University of Tasmania and the University of Toronto, respectively, Together, they have a series of highly detailed and robust databases on the geochemistry and in some cases texture and morphology of thousands of pyrite grains. I think it's around 6,000 pyrite samples in all. So we can use machine learning, specifically cluster analysis, to examine the multivariate correlations across the various major, minor, trace elements in these samples. Here you can see the preliminary cluster results from our Carnegie postdoc Shuang Zhang. He's been able to determine that there are some clear delineations associated with pyrite formational environments. One of these very clear delineations is associated with temperature. Samples cluster into two distinct groups, high and low temperature formation. These groups can be further clustered by their specific formational environments within the high temperature and low temperature regimes. Therefore, we are now able to develop an integrated clustering classification scheme in which we can predict the formational environment of any pyrite specimen of unknown origin. We can also apply a similar workflow to other mineral systems, and we're doing that. Currently, we've developed a database of over 100,000 garnet analyses, and that data paper will be submitted to ESSD in the very near future, as well as a database of 1,600 pre-solar silicon carbide grains, 178,000 feldspar samples, and 3,500 chlorite species, with many others in the works. So we're excited to be able to examine the natural kind clustering of these systems, and eventually the hope is to get to all mineral systems, right? So I'd like to just briefly mention what we've been doing with those pre-solar silicon carbide grains. Firstly, these tiny remnant grains of star formation have been classified by their nitrogen and carbon isotopic ratios, and were thought to fall into 6 groups related to different stellar environments. However, Asma Bougibar with us at Carnegie has led a project in collaboration with pre-solar grain expert Larry Nittler, also based at Carnegie, to explore these data and to see if the previously held ideas about pre-solar grain formational environment matches what the data say. Asma has performed cluster analysis, not only on the carbon and nitrogen ratios, but also on the silicon isotopic ratios as well. In the figure on the right, you can see the clustering results overlaid on the nitrogen carbon diagram for the ease of comparison of the two. And according to the clustering results of these 4 ratios, there are actually 9 distinct groupings. Specifically, it looks like there are likely actually 2 types of AB stars, which are generally thought to form in either J-type carbon stars, born again AGB stars, or type 2 supernovas. There are 2 types of X grains thought to form in supernovas, and there are 2 types of MS grains, which are thought to form in low to intermediate mass AGB stars of low metallicity. And I'll leave it there since she just submitted this last week, and I don't want to steal her thunder and give away too much, but there are some pretty exciting results. And there are things that confirmed previous ideas, which is great. And there are also things that are changing the way people think about these solar and pre-solar grain systems. So I've gone over a number of projects here. I gave them to you really quickly. So I'd like to just summarize some of those key findings. First, we've been able to predict the number of missing mineral species on Earth. And with the same work, we've hypothesized that Earth's mineral diversity and distribution is a planetary scale biosignature. We've observed higher dimensional multivariate trends embedded in network topologies, and we can use these to address various scientific questions, including putting protein evolution on an absolute timeline through Earth history. We've predicted the location of unknown minerals, analog environments, and mineral inventories of selected locations. And we're using cluster analysis to classify and predict the formational environments of mineral specimens based on geochemical data alone. And through this work, we're developing an evolutionary system of mineralogy that places mineral classification in the context of planetary evolution and formational environment. And with that, I'll leave you with a broad statement that governs my thinking in the projects I choose to pursue, and that is that answering questions in these complex evolving systems requires a multivariate and interdisciplinary approach to integrating, visualizing, and analyzing our rich data resources in Earth and planetary materials. And speaking of data resources, for the sake of time, I didn't actually show you any of those or where they are, but they are all open access and freely available. You can shoot me an email if you're interested in something specific. You can also find them through the 4D website or my personal website you see there. And if you are interested in exploring any of our live interactive networks, you can go to our dtdi.carnegiescience.edu website and play with those there. And so with that, I'd like to thank my funders, my many co-authors, not all of which I was able to list here today. today, as well as MSA, of course, and AGI for inviting me, and especially you all for tuning in. And so I think I can probably take questions.
Okay, if you'd like to put your questions in question box. Chat box there. You might get off easy, Shauna. So no questions? Oh, this one says, I don't know if you can see, can you see that? Sharing the links?
Definitely. I'll do that right now.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful.
Of course, I'm spelling it wrong. So, oh, actually my computer is auto-correcting for me. So forgive me, I'm gonna resend that. That link is actually not correct. See if I do it this way, if it won't auto-correct me. There we go. I don't know why it corrects DTDI to DDDI, but okay. So DTDI is, those are, you can find the live networks there. And of course the 4D website, there are links there and some explanations of some of our projects that we're working on.
Okay, so you just have a question here?
Sure. Okay, sorry, I'm just copying this last one. Okay, so I guess I'll read the question out. What role will these data clumping technologies play in the future of mineralogy and geology, and do you anticipate it playing an increasingly prominent role? I think I might be biased in my answer to that, but I think absolutely I see it playing a huge role. I see that this is very much so relating minerals in a holistic way to the formation of geologic environments, of geologic deposits, of planetary bodies. And I think that it's becoming a very powerful predictive tool. Again, you know, when we're on Mars and we find a mineral, you know, it can narrow the range of what could have happened there, right? But we can make that even more narrow. We can get even more specific if we look at the trace and minor elements. And you know, people are doing this work. This is not necessarily new, right? People are doing this in individual mineral systems, and you know, it's long known that certain isotopic ratios signal certain things. But what we're doing that's different is we're bringing this all together, and we're looking at this on a much larger scale. And so we're looking at this as whole systems, and we're looking at how each of these minerals has changed throughout its entire Earth's history, the entire history of our solar system, actually. So, you know, we'll follow, and we're working on a project right now to look at how copper mineralization has changed from the start of our solar system to modern day, and the different environments that can possibly form. So I think this is going to certainly play an increasingly prominent role in this evolutionary system of mineralogy. Data science techniques overall, I think, are absolutely going to play a much more prominent role in everyone's research. And that's, you know, we have a lot of data. And this is a way that to kind of get out of the, you know, when you're looking at things at XY plots, or you're just looking at data tables, you're missing a lot of things. And we often, you know, we're struggling, and we're trying to figure out how to see these trends in our data. And, you know I personally wasn't very well trained in how to do that. We're not, right? We don't, you know, we know statistics and we know some advanced math, but we often don't know machine learning, and we don't know how to code. And it's something that really opens up the way that you can see your data and the relationships that you can actually see and characterize. So what I see is, especially with, you know, the undergrads and graduate students, I see they are so excited about this, and they love coding, but they kind of grew up with it more than people my age and older, you know, so they're much more comfortable with learning to code, and they're super excited because they see, you know, we can really do stuff with this. So I think our work will play a pretty big role. Again, I'm biased, but I think data science overall is going to play a pretty significant role. So I'll go to the next question. So let's see, on scaling the computation processing, what is the dimension of data that is posing the greatest challenge on having sufficient computational resources, geographic, geochemical, or temporal? That's a good question. So what we were initially trying to do was actually look at all minerals on Earth at once. And so we're not just looking at a correlation of, calcite and pyrite, right? I'm looking at a correlation of calcite and pyrite, and then I'm looking at a correlation of calcite, pyrite, and another mineral. Calcite, pyrite, and another, and another, and another. And so basically you end up with this huge, you could think of it as a data table if you wanted to, but millions and millions of lines of these possible permutations of these over, 5,600 mineral species, every permutation of every combination that can exist is huge. So that was really our biggest hurdle. And that's why we chose the geographic, geochemical, and temporal. I'm not remembering off the top of I think the geographic is right now the most computationally intensive one. I think it's our largest one, but we can still handle it with the computational. We don't need a supercomputer to do it. So this is something that we hope people will be able to potentially even run on their local machine. Your laptop will sound like it's taking off. I don't know if you've ever tried to run some heavy processes on your laptop and it's like, shh, it will sound like that. But I think we've got it to a small enough scale that you can actually do this on your local machine. And that was the goal. We want this to be accessible. We want people to be able to use it and to play with it and to explore their own ideas with it. So, I think geographic is the biggest right now. But the goal, once we optimize the code, right now the code is designed for not really for our purpose. And so we're having to optimize it. It's designed for, like Amazon, and it's designed for online shopping and things like that. So we're trying to optimize it to make it something that is much leaner and really just does exactly what we want it to do. But we're actually going to add another complication to that will be more computationally intensive. And that's what I like to call user information. So if you think about this in the Amazon analog, if you know where I live, if you know my demographics, my age, things like that, you're actually going to be able to tailor your probabilities better for me. And so it's the same thing with these mineral systems. If we know the tectonic environment, if we know something else about the geology, then we can actually start to tailor those predictions even more. So we're going to be adding in this user information, this geologic context, that will also make it more computationally intensive. So there's a lot of work to be done there to make this something that can run on your local machine, which is ultimately the goal. We could run this on a server, but I hope that we'll be able to get this small enough to go on everyone's local machine. So, all right, I think I answered that. So let's see, another question. So thank you, first of all, Paul. I appreciate that. And so Paul's question is, I'm wondering if this predictive analysis could be used in industries such as mining to predict what ore minerals could be present. Absolutely. And not just in mining. I mean, it could also be predictive in anything where you're trying to find something that minerals can signify. You don't actually even have to limit it to minerals, right? You could even put in vegetation. You could put in any kind of parameters you wanted. So this specific application is very, very interesting to, I think, people that are interested in finding ore bodies. It's absolutely perfect for that. If there's a mineral assemblage that characterizes a certain type of deposit, we can predict where to find that, even if that mineral assemblage isn't already known to exist there, right? So yeah, we can say, okay, well, if you're looking for this combination of 10 minerals or this combination of 5 minerals, you have a probability of, it's 90% likely you're going to find it here. It's 70% chance you're going to find it there. So I think this could really change the way exploration is being done. So we do get a lot of interest from mining companies and economic geologists in doing this. I think it can be really powerful in that application. Our interest is more so I'm very interested in finding planetary analog sites. Often when we're finding these mineral assemblages on Mars, we're asking ourselves the question, okay, so what does this mean in terms of geology? And of course, we go to our most studied geologic planet, and that is Earth. And so we're often going and saying, okay, I'll go to the Rough Project websites, to the Mineral Evolution database, and we'll type in these different minerals, and I can say, okay, so it's like this environment. But if all of those minerals aren't known to exist in that deposit right now, in MinDat or in the Mineral Evolution database, then I'm not going to find that with a basic search. And so that's where you need something that can start assigning these probabilities so we can go out there and see, okay, is this actually an analog site? So yes, very interesting to mining companies, lots of industry applications. Okay, so another question from Vincent. So what challenges and surprises did you encounter as you progressed into the more data-driven systems? And let's see, from a more geoscience or geologically typical background. So yeah, so I remember the first time that I went to a meeting at RPI. It was in June 2016. And I'll always remember it because it just kind of changed everything that I was going to do from then on. And so we went to RPI, to Peter Fox's group, and got to see some of the stuff that they do. So they're a data science group with lots of applications in different fields, but they do a lot in earth science. And it was just incredible, the stuff that they were able to do. I was like on Excel, I'm sometimes hand drawing out my figures and things like this. And, I could code in R a little bit to do some statistics and things like that. But what they were able to show us with their networks, with their starburst diagrams, with their predictive machine learning algorithms, we were just blown away. So the first thing that struck me before I really got into it, which I don't think is your question, but was the power of these methods. That, wow, we can do so much, we can see so much. That just really blew me away straight away as soon as I met the people that were doing this. And then once I dug into it a little bit more, I think the thing that struck me was how much data cleaning actually goes into this, and how much we think that we have the data in a format that is machine readable, and it isn't. So actually, I work with a number of projects and initiatives to try and get these data resources into machine readable and interoperable formats. Because yeah, the data exists, but sometimes, in worst case scenario, the data exists on someone's hard drive or in papers that have never been digitized. A little bit better than that, but still bad, is that they exist in digitized papers, but not in a tabular format that is truly machine readable. So I'm working with some different colleagues to try to be able to use machine learning to actually extract data out of PDFs to put it in a tabular format. But we've also done a lot of brute force. We do this a lot by hand. We go to the paper and we type it in. And there are amazing resources out there, like EarthChem is incredible for geochemical data, incredible what they have done. And that's a huge resource, and that's something that we rely on. Of course, we've done a lot through the Mineral Evolution database. Again, I hope you all will check that out. That's mineral locality age data. So if you want to know, dated mineral localities, that's a great place to go. We have over 1 million mineral locality pairs. Again, that has been largely brute force. So I think the need to clean data was something that I really was struck by, but also just the power of these methods that they can, the math is really powerful, and the visualization opportunities are really, really powerful. So yeah, I think those are the two main things that really surprised me. So I'm seeing another question from Carolyn. So you mentioned cleaning up the data. What type of coding is most commonly used in these studies? Yeah, so most people code in either R or Python. There are other languages, MATLAB, C, Java, things like that, that pretty much everything, if you can do R and Python, there's a wrapper for these other codes, or there's a way to do it in R or Python. So if you know those two languages, you're probably going to be pretty good. to do whatever you kind of want to do. So everything that I showed you, the images that I showed you, are the data was cleaned in either R or Python. The math was done in either R or Python. And in the case of the networks, we generate those in JavaScript D3. Because it's much more interactive. So a lot of times the R networks and the Python networks are static. And we really wanted something where we could hover and be able to, get information. Right now, we mainly just have the data labels with name, but you could have anything you wanted on the data label. So you could have, if age, if that's appropriate, location, if that's appropriate, number of locations, things like that. So we really wanted to have that kind of functionality and to be able to pull it out and move it around so you can really see what is connected to what. These networks are a projection from very high dimensional space into two-dimensional space. So being able to move them around can help you really understand what's going on. So we use JavaScript for that. But again, it's something where, if you knew R and you knew Python, you could figure out enough with the D3 to be able to make that happen. So R and Python are really what most people use. Catherine asks, what format is best for researchers to release their data for you to use? We'll take it in whatever format you have. If you have something that you'd like to share with us, that would be amazing. CSV is usually the flat file format we have. So that's a comma separated values. So that's something you can generate in Excel. So you can think of it like a tabular formatted data. So if you think of your Excel spreadsheet, you have a cell, you have information in that cell, and then you have another cell, information in that cell, and you can separate each of those cells. You can separate them by a comma, you can separate them by a tab. And if you go into your Excel, spreadsheet, you don't need to manually put in commas, you don't need to manually put in tabs. Excel automatically does that. It does that for you. So if you go to save it as a CSV instead of an Excel file, it will just automatically put in those commas for you when you go to send it to me, or it might actually do tabs when you do it in Excel. But anyway, if it's a CSV, if it's any kind of tabular data, that works well. One thing that I will say for people who are generating data and hope to share this, whether it's with us, whether it's with another database, and I hope you all do eventually plan to share any of the data you're generating. There are certain things you can do for best practices. So things like saving it as a CSV. Sometimes when Microsoft does its updates, which can be very frustrating for us all, sometimes you can lose the ability to open an Excel file. So that's why saving it as a CSV can be really useful. And one thing to consider when you're saving it as a CSV is that colors do not save. So any kind of formatting in the cells, bold, italics, things like that, do not save. And that's partially because those types of things are not very machine readable. So it's nice for the human eye, but computers, and we can get computers to read that, but it's a lot more work on the data cleaning process. So if you can avoid using color schemes, if you can just use numbers or letters or, text to signify what you want to signify, that's better. And if you can avoid like hierarchical schemes, the ideal situation is when you have a data label and everything in that column below that corresponds to that data label. That's really the ideal. But again, if it's not in that format and you don't have the means to put it in that format, anyone who's accepting your data is probably going to be willing to try to help you out with that if they have the means to do that. So let's see. Thank you. You guys are all so sweet. I appreciate that. And let's see, you mentioned copper in the talk. What trends are you seeing in the very old copper compared to the young copper with regard to associations over time? Yeah, we may have talked about this, Paul. Yeah, so basically what we're seeing is, and this is true not only of copper minerals, this is true of all of the redox sensitive minerals, we're seeing an increase in the relative proportion of the more oxidized phases as we go into modern day. So after the great oxidation event, we start seeing that we're still having reduced mineral phases, of course, because they're always reducing environments. But we're starting to see a heavier increase of these more oxidized materials as we move into modern day. And of course, once we're actually in modern day, we also have a lot more ephemeral minerals and things that are associated potentially with, human interaction on the surface of the planet, mining activities and things like that. So we see a kind of a big spike in mineralization in very modern times. But that, with the exception of the human interaction, that's more of a preservational bias. These ephemeral phases, in some cases, could have occurred earlier, but they just wouldn't have been preserved because they're not as robust. So that's where really going back and looking at the copper system as a whole and seeing what could have formed in what environments and what environments were likely to have existed during these different stages of planetary evolution, then we can say, okay, it's very likely that this ephemeral phase that we actually only observe over the last million years or the last 500,000 years or whatever, actually likely occurred 3 billion years ago as well. So those are the types of questions we're trying to answer. And we know that that's true for some phases, and we're trying to figure out which phases, systematically go across all copper minerals and figure out which phases that's true for. But I think redox is probably the biggest, the most notable difference. And as I said, we see, of course, pulses of mineralization associated with supercontinent assembly. So if you look at some of our recent papers, we had a review paper come out recently in Frontiers, where you can see some of the diagrams that show the pulses of mineralization associated with supercontinent assembly. So lots of cool stuff going on there. So thank you all for the great questions and your kind words, and everyone for showing up. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Shauna. I think this was absolutely brilliant. So it's just imagine everybody's clapping. That's the strange thing about these Zooms.
It's the strange thing, right?
You can't hear it. It has to show up there.
Right.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. This is just the first. There we go. There's somebody's got the clap going up there. So I think, if you want to show yourselves and your claps, I think that's a good thing to do.
Thank you. Oh, you guys are so sweet. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take the next half an hour and just turn everybody's cameras on.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
We
got 2.
Yes, that would be good. All right, thanks so much. And this has been recorded, so we'll be able to see it again. Thank you. Bye-bye.